Lieutenant Katie Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle and into the main corridor of Meridian 7. And the sight before her took her breath away in ways she never expected. Because the station stretched for miles in every direction, with architecture that seemed to defy the laws of physics she had studied back on Earth. And creatures of every imaginable shape and size moved through the halls with purpose and grace. She had dreamed of this moment for 3 years. Ever since Earth joined the Galactic Alliance and opened up pathways for humans to prove themselves among the stars. And now she stood as one of only 3 humans accepted into the most prestigious military academy in known space. Which felt both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. A tall insectoid creature with 4 arms and crystalline eyes clicked past her, followed by what looked like a floating jellyfish surrounded by a bubble of water. And Katie had to remind herself not to stare like some country kid visiting the big city for the first time. Because she represented all of humanity here and needed to act professional. Katie Morrison? A voice called out, and she turned to see another human approaching. A young man with sandy hair and an easy smile that reminded her of home. "That's me," she said, extending her hand, and he shook it firmly. "Danny Cooper." "Engineering track," he introduced himself, and his grip was strong and confident, which made Katie feel a little less alone in this alien place. "Combat theory," Katie replied, and Danny's eyebrows rose slightly. "Brave choice," he said with a slight grimace. And before Katie could ask what he meant, another human joined them. A woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, Lisa Grant. "Medical sciences," the woman said without waiting for introductions, and her tone was all business, which Katie could respect. The 3 of them made their way to the orientation hall together. And Katie felt grateful for the company, even though they had just met. Because being surrounded by thousands of alien species made her realize just how far from home she truly was. The orientation lasted 4 hours, and Katie learned more about galactic politics and military structure than she thought possible. But the most important piece of information came at the end when the instructors were announced. And she heard murmurs ripple through the crowd when one name was called. "Advanced Combat Theory will be taught by Instructor Vexstar of Kral," the commandant announced, and the murmurs grew louder. Though Katie couldn't tell if they were impressed or worried, she found out soon enough when she entered her first class the next morning and saw Vexstar for the first time. Because the Kral stood over 8 feet tall with 4 muscular arms and natural armor plating that covered most of his body, and his eyes, all 4 of them, swept across the classroom with an intensity that made Katie's survival instincts scream at her to run. 63 students enter this classroom today, Vexstar began, and his voice rumbled like distant thunder, deep and commanding in a way that demanded attention. "And perhaps 40 will remain by the end of the term, because I do not waste time on those who lack the strength or intelligence to serve in real combat." Katie sat in the 3rd row next to a reptilian, Sarnak cadet, and tried to make herself invisible, which proved impossible when Vexstar's gaze landed directly on her. "Ah, yes. The humans," he said, and there was something in his tone that made Katie's stomach tighten, because it wasn't curiosity or welcome but something closer to disdain. "Earth's representatives. Fresh from your tiny world with your brief and primitive conflicts." Danny sat 2 rows behind Katie, and Lisa was off to the left. And Katie could feel their tension matching her own as every eye in the classroom turned to look at the 3 humans. "Tell me, human," Vexstar said, pointing one of his 4 hands directly at Katie. "What is the longest war your species has ever fought?" Katie's mind raced through her history lessons, and she tried to remember the exact numbers. But before she could answer, Vexstar continued, "Do not bother answering, because I already know," he said with what might have been a smile if Kral could smile, though it looked more like a predator baring teeth. "Your longest conflicts barely span a handful of years. And your entire recorded military history covers less time than some species spend in a single campaign. The Sarnak next to Katie shifted uncomfortably, and Katie noticed several other alien students looking away as if embarrassed by Vextar's words. But the instructor continued without pause. You come from a world with standard gravity, temperate climate, and abundant resources, Vextar said, moving to stand directly in front of Katie's desk, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. And yet you believe you can learn to fight alongside species who evolved in environments that would crush you, freeze you, or burn you alive within moments. Katie felt her face flush with anger, but she bit her tongue and remained silent, because this was her first day and she needed to prove herself through actions, not words. Or at least that's what she told herself, even as her hands clenched into fists beneath the desk. The Krall have led galactic military operations for over 2,000 years. Vextar continued, turning away from Katie to address the full class. And we have done so because we understand warfare in ways that younger, softer species cannot comprehend. And I will teach you what can be taught, though some of you lack the basic foundation to build upon. The class proceeded with Vextar lecturing about tactical formations used in void combat. And Katie took notes furiously while trying to ignore the sick feeling in her stomach, because she had not traveled across the galaxy to be told she was too primitive to learn over the next 3 weeks. Katie discovered that Vextar's opening remarks were not just first-day posturing, but his genuine attitude toward human capabilities. And he found ways to emphasize human inadequacy in nearly every lesson when discussing ground combat. He mentioned that humans lacked the natural armor of Krall or the speed of the Kyrix. And when covering void tactics, he noted that human reaction times were slower than most species. And when analyzing historical battles, he dismissed Earth's military conflicts as barely worth mentioning. Danny and Lisa faced similar treatment, though Vextar seemed to focus most of his criticism on Katie for reasons she couldn't understand. And perhaps it was because she refused to look away when he stared at her. Or maybe because she continued to score well on practical exams. Despite his low expectations, the breaking point came during Tactical Simulation Week, when each student was assigned a complex combat scenario to resolve. And Katie received her assignment with growing dread as she read through the parameters. She was given command of a small fleet defending a colony world against overwhelming enemy forces. And the enemy had superior numbers, better positioning, and more advanced technology, which made victory seem impossible. Katie spent 2 days analyzing the scenario from every angle, and she recognized it as a modified version of the Battle of Kelros, a famous Krall victory that was taught to first-year students as an example of perfect tactical execution. But Vextar had altered the parameters to put her in the losing position. She could play it safe and minimize casualties while accepting defeat, which would be the sensible choice by Academy standards. Or she could try something that would either prove her point or get her expelled from the program entirely. Katie made her choice and began programming her strategy into the simulation system. And as she worked through the night, she thought about all the battles throughout human history, where smaller forces defeated larger ones through unconventional tactics and sheer determination. The next morning, she walked into the simulation chamber with her head held high, and Vextar watched from the observation deck alongside several other instructors and the entire class. Because tactical simulations were always public events. Begin when ready. Cadet Morrison. Vextar's voice came through the speakers, and Katie could hear the anticipation in his tone, as if he already knew how this would end. Katie activated the simulation and watched as her fleet materialized in orbit around the colony world, and the enemy forces appeared on her sensors like a swarm of angry insects. And she took a deep breath before giving her first command. Katie studied the tactical display as the enemy fleet moved into attack formation. And she knew from her analysis that following standard defensive doctrine would result in total defeat within an hour. So she did something that would shock everyone watching. She divided her forces into 3 groups, instead of maintaining a unified defensive line, which violated the first principle taught at the academy about never splitting your forces when outnumbered. And she sent the smallest group directly toward the enemy flagship. In what appeared to be a suicidal charge, the observation deck went quiet, and Katie could imagine Vexstar leaning forward with satisfaction, thinking she had panicked and made a fatal error right at the start. But Katie wasn't panicking, because she had studied Earth's military history more thoroughly than any alien instructor expected, and she knew that sometimes the only way to win was to do what your enemy thought was impossible. The small squadron raced toward the enemy lines while broadcasting false sensor readings that made them appear to be carrying antimatter warheads, which they weren't, but the enemy commander had no way to know that. And Katie watched with grim satisfaction as the enemy fleet broke formation to intercept what they believed was a desperate final strike. The moment the enemy committed to the interception, Katie sprang her real trap, because her second force group had been moving into position, using the colony world's magnetic field to mask their approach. And they struck the enemy's exposed flank with concentrated fire that destroyed 6 ships before the enemy even realized what was happening. The enemy commander reacted exactly as Katie predicted, pulling forces back from the pursuit to defend against this new threat, which created a gap in their formation. And Katie sent her third group through that gap like a knife between ribs. The simulation continued for 47 minutes, and Katie lost almost a quarter of her ships in the process. But she used every trick she could think of from human military history, including false retreats, feigned communications, and sacrificial decoy units that drew enemy fire while her real attack forces maneuvered into position. She won through attrition and deception rather than superior firepower or brilliant defensive positioning. And when the simulation ended with the enemy fleet destroyed and her remaining forces victorious, the observation deck remained silent for a long moment. Katie exited the simulation pod with her heart pounding, and she looked up at the observation window where she could see Vexstar's silhouette. Though she couldn't read his expression from this distance, the door to the observation deck opened, and the class filed out, and several alien students gave Katie looks that ranged from impressed to horrified. But no one spoke to her direct. The Vexstar emerged last, and his forearms were crossed over his chest in a way that Katie had learned meant displeasure or anger among the crowd, and his 4 eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to step back. Cadet Morrison, "Explain your tactics," he said, and his voice was cold and controlled, which somehow seemed worse than if he had shouted. Katie straightened her spine and met his gaze, because she had committed to this course of action and would not back down now. "Regardless of the consequences, I recognize the scenario as the Battle of Kelros with modified parameters," she began, keeping her voice steady. "And I realized that following standard defensive doctrine would result in defeat. So I applied principles from human military theory that emphasize adaptability and acceptable losses." "Acceptable losses," Vexstar repeated, and he moved closer to Katie until he loomed over her. "You sacrificed nearly 25% of your forces, and many of those casualties occurred in your initial decoy attack, which means you sent crews to their deaths knowing they would not survive." "Yes, instructor," Katie said, and she refused to apologize for tactics that had won the engagement. The decoy squadron drew the enemy into breaking formation, which created the opportunity for victory. And in war, commanders must sometimes sacrifice some to save many. A murmur ran through the gathered students, and Katie noticed several of them exchanging looks of shock. because most galactic species had evolved beyond the concept of acceptable casualties, preferring to retreat and regroup rather than accept heavy losses. Your tactics were brutal and wasteful, Vextar said, and his voice grew louder, and they demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of modern warfare. Because civilized species do not throw away lives like garbage. Katie felt anger rising in her chest, and she knew she should stay quiet and accept the criticism. But something inside her snapped after weeks of constant belittlement with respect. "Instructor, my tactics won the engagement," she said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended. "And if brutal tactics are so ineffective, perhaps you can explain why the Krall lost their last 3 major conflicts against species they considered inferior." The observation deck went completely silent, and Katie realized she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Because challenging an instructor's expertise was bad enough, but bringing up recent Krall military failures was something else entirely. Vextar's 4 eyes narrowed, and Katie saw his hands clench into fists. And for a moment she thought he might physically attack her right there in front of everyone. "You dare question Krall military doctrine?" he asked, and his voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You, who come from a species that has barely left its home system, who fight with primitive weapons and outdated strategies. I question any doctrine that prioritizes pride over results," Katie shot back. And she knew she was digging herself deeper, but couldn't seem to stop. And maybe the reason humanity survived long enough to reach the stars is because we learned to adapt instead of clinging to traditions that no longer work. Several students gasped, and Danny moved forward as if to intervene. But Lisa grabbed his arm and held him back, because there was nothing they could do now. "The Krall have led galactic military operations for 2 millennia, Vextar said. And he took another step toward Katie. "And in that time, we have defended the Alliance against threats your primitive mind cannot imagine. And we have done so through discipline, honor, and proper tactical doctrine. Then why do you keep losing?" Katie asked, and the words came out before she could stop them. "If your doctrine is so superior, why has the Alliance suffered 3 major defeats in the last decade? And why are younger species like the Varan winning battles that Krall commanders abandoned as unwinnable?" Vextar's control shattered, and Katie saw the moment it happened in his eyes. And she braced herself for whatever came next. The instructor's hand moved faster than Katie expected, and she felt the impact across her face before she fully registered that he had struck her. And the force of the blow sent her stumbling backward into a desk pane exploded across her cheek and jaw. And Katie tasted blood in her mouth, and for a moment her vision swam with stars. But she managed to keep her feet. The entire observation deck stood frozen in shock, because physical discipline was absolutely forbidden at the academy, and instructors who struck students faced immediate dismissal and disgrace. But Vextar was a decorated war hero. And Katie was just a human cadet who had pushed him too far. Katie touched her split lip with shaking fingers and felt blood on her chin, and she looked up at Vextar, who stood over her with his chest heaving and his hands still clenched. She could report this incident and probably get Vextar removed from his position. Or she could file a formal complaint that would drag through academy bureaucracy for months. Or she could do what every instinct in her human brain was screaming at her to do. Katie straightened up and wiped the blood from her mouth, and she looked directly into Vextar's 4 eyes with an expression that was part smile and part challenge. "Is that the best you've got?" she asked, and her voice came out steady despite the pain. Then she said something that made the entire observation deck erupt into chaos, because she invoked an ancient Krall tradition that hadn't been used in over a century. "I challenge your authority to teach," Katie declared. And she spoke the formal words in Krall language, which she had learned specifically for this possibility. and I demand trial by combat to prove your doctrine is flawed." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. And for 3 heartbeats, nobody moved or spoke. And then chaos erupted as students began shouting in multiple languages, and several instructors rushed into the observation deck. Katie stood her ground, while blood dripped from her chin. And she kept her eyes locked on Vextar, who looked like he might explode from rage or shock, or both. "You cannot be serious," Vextar finally said, and his voice shook with emotion. "You are a human, barely 5.5 feet tall and weak by any galactic standard. And you believe you can challenge me in combat? The law of trial by combat is clear," Katie said. And she was grateful that her voice didn't shake despite her pounding heart. When an instructor strikes a student in anger, that student may challenge the instructor's authority. And the challenge must be answered through unarmed combat in the traditional arena. An elderly Kral instructor pushed through the crowd, and Katie recognized him as Master Kelvin, who taught ancient military history. And his expression was grave as he addressed Vextar. "The human is correct about the law," Kelvin said, and his voice carried authority that made even Vextar pause. "And you struck her in front of witnesses? Which means her challenge is legitimate under our oldest traditions." "This is madness," Vextar protested. But Katie could hear uncertainty creeping into his voice. The law was written for challenges between Kral, not for combat between species with vastly different physical capabilities. "The law makes no distinction about species," Kelvin replied. And he looked at Katie with something that might have been respect or pity. "And you invoked that law yourself when you chose to teach at this academy, because all instructors swear to uphold Kral traditions as part of their contract." The academy's commandant arrived within minutes, and Commander Hayes was an elderly diplomat with silver skin and eyes that seemed to see through lies. And she listened to multiple witness accounts before making her decision. "The challenge stands," Hayes declared, and her voice cut through the arguing voices. "And combat will take place in 3 days at noon in the ceremonial arena. And the terms are traditional. Unarmed combat until one fighter yields or cannot continue." Katie felt her stomach drop, because 3 days seemed both too long and not nearly long enough to prepare for fighting someone who stood 8 feet tall with 4 arms and natural armor. Danny and Lisa pulled her aside after the crowd dispersed, and both of them looked at Katie like she had lost her mind. "What were you thinking?" Lisa demanded, and her medical training was probably already cataloging all the ways Katie could die in this fight. "He's twice your size and 4 times your strength. And he's been training in Kral combat arts since childhood. I was thinking that I'm tired of being told humans don't belong here," Katie said. And she gingerly touched her swollen jaw. "And I was thinking that someone needs to prove we're more than soft creatures from an easy world. There are better ways to prove that than getting yourself killed," Danny said. And he looked genuinely worried. "You could have reported the assault and gotten him fired, and you would have won without risking your life." Katie shook her head, and she knew they wouldn't understand unless she explained it properly. So she tried to find the right words. "If I report him, he gets fired, and I become the human who couldn't handle a little conflict," she said. And she met their eyes. "But if I fight him and win, I prove that humans can stand against anyone. And if I lose, at least I go down fighting instead of running to administrators for protection." Lisa sighed and pinched the bridge of her nose. But Katie saw resignation in her expression, because Lisa knew that Katie had already made up her mind. "Then we help you train," Lisa said finally. "And we figure out every possible advantage you can find. Because raw strength isn't going to win this fight." The next 3 days passed in a blur of research and physical training. And Katie learned everything she could about Kral anatomy and fighting styles. And she discovered some interesting facts that gave her hope Kral evolved on a high-gravity world with thick atmosphere. which made them incredibly strong, but not built for extended combat. And their forearms were an advantage in close quarters, but also meant they had more limbs to defend. And their natural armor was thickest on their chest and back, but thinner at the joints. Katie also researched human combat sports and martial arts, and she focused on techniques developed specifically for smaller fighters to defeat larger opponents. And she practiced targeting joints and using an opponent's weight against them. Danny found historical records of the few times trial by combat had been invoked in the past, and all of them involved Crawl fighting other Crawl. And the average fight lasted less than 10 minutes because Crawl preferred overwhelming force to extended combat. You need to make this last longer than he expects, Danny said while Katie practiced endurance drills. Because if he's like most Crawl, he'll be trained for quick victories. And humans are built for persistence. News of the challenge spread through the entire station. And Katie couldn't walk through the corridors without students and instructors staring at her. And she heard whispers in dozens of languages, most of them predicting her swift defeat on the morning of the combat. Katie woke early and tried to eat breakfast, but her stomach was too tight with nerves. So she settled for water and spent an hour in meditation, trying to center herself for what was coming. Lisa checked her over with medical scanners and declared her as ready as possible. And Danny gave her a small device that would monitor her vital signs during the fight, in case she needed immediate medical intervention. You don't have to do this, Lisa said one final time. You can still withdraw the challenge and accept a formal apology from Vextar. Katie shook her head and pulled on her training clothes, which were simple and flexible, designed for movement rather than protection. Yes, I do have to do this, she said quietly, because every human who comes after me will be judged by what happens today. And I need to show them that we don't back down. The walk to the arena felt like a march to execution, and Katie's legs felt heavy despite all her training. But she kept her head up and her expression calm. The ceremonial arena was an ancient structure built by the Crawl centuries ago, and it consisted of a circular floor surrounded by rising tiers of seats. And every seat was filled with spectators from across the station. Katie entered through the challenger's gate and saw thousands of eyes watching her, and the weight of their expectations pressed down on her shoulders. Like a physical burden, Vexter entered from the opposite gate, and he wore traditional Crawl combat wraps on his 4 hands, and his natural armor gleamed under the arena lights. And he looked every inch the warrior. He was Commander Hayes, stood at the center of the arena and raised her hands for silence. And the crowd quieted immediately. This combat is sanctioned under ancient Crawl law, Hayes announced, and her voice carried to every corner of the arena. And it will continue until one fighter yields or is rendered unable to continue. And the winner's position will be considered validated by tradition. She looked at Katie and then at Vextar, and her expression was carefully neutral. Do both fighters accept these terms? She asked. I accept, Vextar said, and his voice was calm and confident. Katie took a deep breath and felt her heart hammering in her chest. And she thought about her family back on Earth and wondered if they would be proud or horrified by what she was about to do. I accept, she said, and her voice carried across the arena. Despite her fear, Hayes nodded and stepped back to the edge of the combat circle. And she raised one hand high. Begin, she called. And she dropped her hand. Vextar moved forward with terrifying speed, and Katie barely had time to dodge as his first strike whistled past her head, and she felt the displaced air ruffle her hair. Katie rolled to the side and came up in a defensive stance, and Vextar pursued her with relentless aggression, and his forearms struck from multiple angles simultaneously in combinations that would have overwhelmed most opponents. She blocked what she could and dodged what she couldn't. And within the first minute, she took 3 solid hits that sent pain shooting through her ribs and shoulder. But she gritted her teeth and kept moving. Vexstar fought like an avalanche, all power and momentum, trying to end the fight quickly with overwhelming force. And Katie realized he was following the traditional crawl combat doctrine that emphasized decisive early strikes, but Katie didn't fight like a crawl. And she didn't try to match his strength, because that would be suicide. And instead, she focused on survival and observation, learning his patterns and looking for weaknesses. The crowd roared as Vexstar landed a heavy blow to Katie's midsection that lifted her off her feet, and she crashed to the arena floor, gasping for air. And for a moment, she couldn't breathe, and panic threatened to overwhelm her. Vexstar stood over her and waited, because crawl tradition demanded he give his opponent a chance to yield with dignity. And Katie knew that if she stayed down, the fight would be over. She forced air into her lungs and tasted blood, and every instinct screamed at her to stay down and accept defeat. But she thought about every human who had been told they were too weak or too primitive. And she pushed herself to her feet. The crowd's roar changed tone, and Katie heard surprise mixed with respect, because most species would have yielded after a blow like that. "You have courage," Vexstar acknowledged, and there was something in his voice that might have been approval. "But courage alone will not save you from defeat." He attacked again, and Katie moved differently this time, because she had learned what she needed to know about his fighting style. And she began implementing her own strategy. She stopped trying to block his heavy strikes and instead focused on evasion, using her smaller size and lower center of gravity to slip past his attacks. And she started targeting specific points on his body with quick, precise strikes. Katie hit him in the elbow joint of his upper right arm, and she saw him wince slightly, and she followed up with a kick to the side of his knee. And she wasn't strong enough to hurt him seriously, but she could accumulate damage over time. Adjusted his tactics and tried to corner her against the arena wall. And Katie let him think he had succeeded. And when he committed to a powerful forearm strike, she dropped low and swept his legs. The crawl instructor stumbled but didn't fall, because his balance was too good and his center of gravity too low. But Katie had achieved her goal of disrupting his attack rhythm. The fight continued, and minutes stretched into quarter hours. And Katie took more hits than she could count, and her body accumulated bruises and cuts. But she refused to stay down. She noticed that Vexstar's breathing was getting heavier, and his movements were becoming fractionally slower. And she realized that her strategy was working, because crawl physiology wasn't built for extended combat. Katie's species had evolved through persistence hunting on the African plains, chasing prey for hours or even days until it collapsed from exhaustion. And humans had the best endurance of any species on Earth. And that evolutionary advantage was showing itself. Now she increased her pace and forced Vexstar to keep moving, and she targeted his joints repeatedly. And she used every technique she had learned from human martial arts that emphasized leverage over strength. 20 minutes into the fight, Vexstar landed another heavy blow that sent Katie sprawling. And this time, she didn't get up immediately. And the crowd held its breath. Katie lay on the arena floor and felt her body screaming in protest. And she knew she had cracked at least one rib, and her left eye was swelling shut. And blood ran from her nose and mouth, but she also saw that Vexstar was breathing hard and favoring his right knee where she had kicked it repeatedly, and his upper left arm hung slightly lower than the others, which meant the joint damage was affecting his fighting ability. She pushed herself up once more, and the crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and disbelief, because no one expected a human to withstand this level of punishment. "Why do you continue?" Vexstar asked, and he sounded genuinely confused. "You cannot win through attrition. I will not yield to someone I can defeat with ease." Katie spat blood and gave him a grin that was probably more terrifying than reassuring, because her teeth were stained red. "That's where you're wrong," she said. And her voice was rough but determined, because humans don't know when to quit. And we've survived everything Earth could throw at us through sheer, stubborn refusal to die. She attacked instead of defending. And she caught Vextar off guard, because wounded prey wasn't supposed to go on the offensive. And she used his moment of surprise to land a solid strike to his already damaged knee. Instructor stumbled and dropped to one knee. And Katie followed up with a combination that targeted his elbow joints and throat. And she was too close for him to use his superior reach. Effectively, Vextar roared and threw her off with raw strength. And Katie hit the ground hard enough to see stars. But she rolled with the impact and came up ready to continue 30 minutes. And both fighters were showing serious wear. But Katie's endurance training was proving its worth. And she was still moving with purpose, while Vextar's strikes were becoming more telegraphed. 40 minutes. And Vextar's breathing was labored, and sweat poured down his armored hide. And his forearms were no longer coordinating as smoothly as they had at the start. Katie's body was a massive pain. And she was pretty sure she had internal bleeding, and her vision kept blurring. But she had been hurt before, and learned to function through pain. 50 minutes. And the arena had gone quiet, as spectators realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Because no one expected a fight between such mismatched opponents to last this long. Katie saw her opening when Vextar threw a wild combination that left his ribs exposed. And she stepped inside his guard and delivered a series of rapid strikes to his solar plexus. And she put every remaining bit of her strength into those blows. Vextar staggered backward and tried to raise his arms to defend. But they wouldn't respond properly because the joint damage and exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Katie pressed her advantage and swept his legs again. And this time, he fell. And she followed him down and trapped his upper right arm in a joint lock that would break the elbow if he struggled. Yield, she demanded through gritted teeth. And she could barely see through the blood and sweat in her eyes. Vextar tried to push her off with his other arms. But he had no leverage, and his strength was finally failing him. And Katie tightened the lock until he gasped in pain. For a long moment they stayed frozen in that position. And Katie wondered if Kral Honor would force him to let her break his arm rather than yield. But then she felt him tap her shoulder 3 times with his lower left hand. "I yield," he said. And his voice was hoarse with exhaustion and pain. Katie released the lock immediately and rolled away. And she tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. And she collapsed to her hands and knees. The arena exploded with noise as thousands of spectators reacted to what they had just witnessed. And Katie heard cheering in dozens of languages. But it all seemed distant, and unreal. Medical teams rushed onto the arena floor. And Katie felt hands supporting her as Lisa appeared beside her with a medical scanner. "You crazy, brilliant idiot," Lisa said, and her voice shook with emotion. "You actually did it." Katie looked across the arena and saw medics helping Vextar to his feet. And the crawl instructor was staring at her with all 4 eyes. And his expression was complex and unreadable. Commander Hayes approached and stood between the 2 fighters. And she raised her voice to be heard over the crowd. "The challenge is concluded," Hayes announced. "And Cadet Katie Morrison is declared the victor, and by law and tradition, Instructor Vextar's authority to teach is questioned." She paused and looked at both of them. And Katie saw approval in the commander's expression. "However, the purpose of this tradition is not to destroy, but to teach," Hayes continued. "And I believe both participants have learned valuable lessons today." Katie spent 3 days in the medical ward, recovering from her injuries. And the doctors, a mix of different species with different approaches to healing, worked together to repair her cracked ribs and internal bleeding. And they seemed impressed that she had survived the fight at all. Danny and Lisa visited every day. And they brought news from around the station. And apparently, the fight had been recorded and was spreading through the galactic network. And humans across Alliance space were celebrating Katie's victory. "You're famous," Danny said with a grin. And there are already 3 different songs about the fight, and one of them is in crawl, which is apparently a huge honor. Katie shifted carefully in her medical bed and winced at the pain. Because even with advanced medicine, healing took time, and her body felt like one giant bruise. "I don't want to be famous," she said quietly. "And I just wanted to prove that humans belong here." "Well, you definitely proved that," Lisa replied. And she was reviewing Katie's medical charts with professional interest. "And you also proved that human endurance is no joke, because the doctors said most species would have died from the accumulated trauma you sustained." On the 4th day, Katie was cleared to leave the medical ward with strict instructions to take it easy, and she returned to her quarters, expecting to rest and catch up on missed coursework instead. She found a formal summons waiting for her, requesting her presence at Commander Hayes' office, and Katie's stomach tightened with worry, because she wasn't sure if she was about to be commended or expelled. She made her way to the administrative sector and tried not to think about all the ways this meeting could go wrong. And when she entered the commander's office, she found not just Hayes, but also several senior instructors, including Master Kelvin, and surprisingly, Vextarth, crawl instructor, stood with his arms bound in medical wraps, and he had a brace on his right knee. And when he saw Katie, something complex passed across his face. "Cadet Morrison, please sit," Hayes said, and her tone was formal but not unkind. "And we have matters to discuss regarding your future at this academy." Katie sat carefully and tried to read the room, but the assembled instructors' expressions gave nothing away. "Your actions over the past week have created a unique situation," Hayes continued, "and you invoked ancient Kral law, won a trial by combat against a superior opponent, and in doing so, challenged centuries of assumptions about human capabilities." She paused and looked at the other instructors, and Katie saw several of them nod in agreement. "The question before us now is what to do about it," Hayes said. "And by law, Instructor Vextar's authority has been questioned, and he could be removed from his position." Katie started to protest, because despite everything, she didn't actually want to destroy Vextar's career. But Hayes raised a hand to stop her. "However, there is precedent for an alternative resolution," the commander continued. "And if both parties agree, the challenge can be considered a teaching moment rather than a final judgment. And both can learn from the experience and continue in their roles with new understanding." Katie looked at Vextar, and the crawl instructor met her gaze, and she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Respect, Cadet Morrison," Vextar said, and his voice was steady despite the obvious discomfort from his injuries. "I owe you an apology, and I have spent the past days reflecting on my behavior and my assumptions." He shifted his weight and continued, and Katie noticed that speaking seemed difficult for him. "Not physically, but emotionally. I believed that humans were weak because you come from a world with moderate conditions, and I dismissed your military history as primitive and your species as soft," he said. "And I was wrong, and you proved that strength comes in many forms, and endurance and determination are as valuable as raw power." Katie felt emotion tightening her throat, because she hadn't expected this, and she had prepared herself for continued hostility or grudging acknowledgement, but not genuine apology. "I struck you in anger, which violated every principle I claim to uphold," Vextar continued, "and you would have been within your rights to report me and end my career. But instead, you challenged me in a way that honored Kral tradition, and you fought with courage and skill that would make any warrior proud." He paused and then did something that made Katie's eyes widen in shock, because he lowered himself to one knee despite the pain it clearly caused. And in Kral culture, kneeling to someone was a sign of profound respect. "I ask your forgiveness for my prejudice and my violence," Vextar said formally, "and I request permission to learn from you." because you have understanding of warfare that my people have forgotten." Katie stood carefully and walked over to Vextar, and she extended her hand to help him up, just as she had in the arena. "I forgive you," she said quietly, "and I also learn from you because your discipline and knowledge are valuable. And maybe we can teach each other." Vextar took her hand and rose, and the assembled instructors nodded with approval. Commander Hayes smiled, which was apparently rare enough that Master Kelvin looked surprised. "Then we have a new proposal," Hayes said, "and effective immediately. Cadet Morrison is promoted to Senior Cadet with authorization to assist in developing new tactical training programs. And she will work with Instructor Vextar to integrate human strategic thinking with traditional Krull doctrine." Katie felt dizzy with surprise, and she had expected to maybe avoid expulsion. But promotion was beyond anything she imagined. Additionally, "We are inviting more human instructors to join the Academy staff," Hayes continued. "And your victory has demonstrated that Earth has valuable perspectives to contribute to galactic military thinking. And we need to incorporate those perspectives into our training." The meeting concluded with formal paperwork and briefings on Katie's new responsibilities. And when she finally left the administrative sector, she felt overwhelmed and exhausted. Danny and Lisa were waiting for her in the corridor, and they must have seen something in her expression because they both rushed over. "What happened?" Lisa demanded. "And are you expelled or what?" Katie shook her head and tried to find words for what had just occurred. "I'm promoted," she said, and it still didn't feel real. "And I'm going to help redesign the tactical curriculum." Danny whooped and pulled her into a careful hug, mindful of her injuries, and Lisa joined him. And for a moment, Katie let herself enjoy the victory. 6 months passed, and Katie found herself standing in front of a classroom filled with students from 17 different species. And she was teaching advanced combat theory with a new focus on adaptive tactics and unconventional strategies. Vextar sat in the back of the room, attending her class as a student, and he asked challenging questions that pushed Katie to explain her reasoning more clearly. And their relationship had evolved into something like mutual respect and collaborative. Learning Katie's course had become one of the most popular at the Academy, and students competed for spots because her methods were producing results. And several graduates using her tactics had won significant victories in real conflicts. She still faced skepticism from some instructors who believed traditional methods were superior. But she had proven herself in ways that couldn't be dismissed, and more importantly, she had opened doors for other humans to contribute their knowledge. Danny had been promoted to lead a new engineering team that was developing hybrid human-alien technologies. And Lisa was heading a medical research program studying human pain tolerance and healing capabilities. The three of them had dinner together every week, and they talked about their progress and challenges. And they marveled at how far they had come from those first nervous days at the Academy. On one such evening, Katie stood on an observation deck looking out at the stars, and she thought about her journey and what it meant. She had come to Meridian 7 believing she needed to prove that humans deserved a place among the stars, and she had done that through combat and determination. But she had learned something more important along the way. Humanity didn't need to be the strongest or the fastest or the most advanced, because they brought something unique to the galactic community: the memory of struggle and the wisdom that came from surviving on a world that constantly tested them. Earth was a death world by galactic standards, harsh and unforgiving, and it had shaped humans into survivors who understood persistence and adaptation in ways that more civilized species had forgotten. Katie This fight with Vextar hadn't just been about defending her dignity or proving her worth, and it had been about showing the galaxy that different kinds of strength exist, and that sometimes the soft species from the moderate world had steel in their spine that no amount of armor could match. She touched her jaw where Vextar had struck her all those months ago, and the bruise had long since faded. But the lesson remained: humans had earned their place among the stars, not by being better than other species, but by being different, by offering perspectives and capabilities that complemented the strengths of their allies, and by refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose. Katie smiled as she watched ships coming and going from the station, and she thought about all the humans who would follow her path. And she hoped they would remember that belonging wasn't about meeting someone else's standards. It was about standing up when struck down, about fighting when victory seemed impossible,